much education do you need before you die? It's a strange question. Here we are at an ideas festival, talking about innovations. Presumably, we should be talking about how much impact, say, technology could have on education. All the wonderful things that could happen today with the resources that we have. Happily, there are other people here who can tell you about that. So instead, I am asking you this different question. How much education do you need before you die? It's strange, isn't it? Why would I ask that sort of strange question here? Well, it's because I'm a philosopher, and we love strange questions. Strange questions are opportunities to reveal things about our concepts that we might have missed before. Strange questions put pressure on our concepts. We want to feel the discomfort of a question like that and think, what is it about my concept of education that makes that feel odd? So what I'd like for us to do here today is to do a little philosophy together. I'd like for us to try to notice, how do we respond to that question? What can we learn about how we're thinking of education by that discomfort? Okay? Good. Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me with this question is, I think, we're asking how much education? Can we measure education? It seems like a natural thing to do in a technological era. Because of the innovations in technology today, we see everything through a technological lens. We have a technological worldview. We're systems builders, and we need to measure everything very precisely so that we can replicate our experiments and foist them on the world. For the technologist, by the way, the favorite kind of test is a multiple choice test. With a multiple choice test, you don't have to worry about the student running out of control and writing something creative. They just pick one of the options, and the best thing is the computer can grade it automatically. Now, I think with an audience like this, I don't need to spend time criticizing multiple choice tests. But there are other ways, which are less obvious, that our thoughts about measuring education, I think, need to be analyzed. What counts as education? Is there a progression of things that have to be learned? And then that's the education if you go through that progression. In some subjects, like mathematics, that might seem to make sense. There's a series of things you have to learn in order to twiddle your fractions appropriately. But in other subjects, it's an odd notion that there's a sequence of things that would count as education. Think about when reading a great work, maybe a great novel, a piece of history, or even philosophy. You could certainly specify what are the most important things about this work, list them out, and it only counts as education if you learn those things. You could say, here are the learning paths through the text. But something seems off about that. Let's maybe have an example to illustrate it. Plato's Republic. Who here has read Plato's Republic? A tremendous number of you have read it. This is a very well-educated audience. You can put your hands down briefly. Those of you who haven't read it, there's a big film coming out. You'll love it, I'm sure. Well, Plato's Republic, it's a great book. It's a love story, actually, about the love of wisdom. And there's a lot we can learn from it. So those of you who have read it already, I'd like for you to think about, what was the most important thing about that book? What struck you and stayed with you? No, you don't have to tell me now, it's okay. You could scribble it down on a little piece of paper, and then maybe share it with somebody else afterwards, a sort of intellectual speed dating. You can share your Plato memories. Well, what do you think the likelihood is that any two of you wrote the same thing on your piece of paper? I think it's highly unlikely. When I teach a large classroom with maybe 100 students that text, I will get 100 different responses to the text. There might be a young scholar who's only interested in where that dialogue relates to the other dialogues. And is it really an example of Socratic refutation, or is this really Plato's pedantic voice coming in? Oh, but then there might be an engineer who responds differently, who says, how is Plato so fascinated with mathematics? Because mathematics is our subject in engineering. And is he really going to use math to solve all these problems in ethics and politics? And then there might be an artist. They have a different reaction. They're compelled by this idea that Plato seems awfully interested in Homer, but yet he's condemning all the other poets. And when Plato is praising reason, right, the best thing to praise, he calls it the song that dialectic sings. So he's using artistic language, which he says is flawed because it's a flawed imitation of reality, to praise reason. And, well, it just goes on like that. You're again lucky that there's a timer here, because there are 100 different responses that I'll get if I have 100 students. The point is that when reading a classic, the classic reads you. There are infinite number of paths. If you shorten the number of paths, if you say, oh, these are the only important things to learn, it's no longer a great work. So as we go back to our question and we're thinking about education, maybe there's something wrong about the idea that you can list out what counts as education. How else can we understand this concept in our question of measuring education? Well, one might be thinking about just capturing the phenomenon, like education happening, if you could see it in the wild. There's a lot of renewed interest in this now with the increase in learning theory, and we are not far from a time when many classrooms will be equipped with cameras and microphones so that you can actually observe education taking place, as it were. The idea is if you could capture everything about an environment, you could hone in on all the things that happened that led to the learning moment, right? And then you would have known, you could say how much education was there in this classroom or this school district or this country. Well, what couldn't be captured that way? I think of one of the schools I work with, I visited the other day. It was a kindergarten class they were having, and normal kindergarten things were going on, a lot of behavior regulation. The teacher says, 1, 2, 3, eyes on me. And then the students, 1, 2, eyes on you, this sort of thing. I won't do that exercise with you because you're very attentive already. But that's the warm-up exercise. And then the teacher tells the students, okay, take your workbook and go work on a page of it by yourself. Well, one student in this class, a little 5-year-old girl, she takes her workbook, she comes over, and she sits down right next to me at the table where I'm observing. She has wide eyes and a very shy gaze, and she doesn't look directly at me. She just sits there and starts doing her assignment. It's kind of a neat assignment. There's a kind of a picture of a fruit on one side of a page, and on the other side it says, draw the fruit. And so she traces out the fruit she sees. Then it gets more complicated. The next one, there's a picture of a fruit, and it says, draw a different fruit. So there's a banana, and she kind of tentatively starts to make an apple-like figure. And then at some point she does this. She doesn't fully look at me. She just turns her head a little bit. And I'm next to her, and I just do this. And she continues her drawing. That's the story. Exciting story, isn't it? Well, that's some education happening there. Education is always going on. You can't capture what's going on there by saying, well, what did we get through the microphone or the cameras? There's very little. The action at that time is inside of her head. There's something that she needs in some inchoate sense, some sense of support or encouragement or containment. And it's one of a million episodes that are constantly happening that are all part of a continuous stream of education. The basic fact of human presence, of one mind responding to another dynamically, has since time immemorial been the basic principle of education. And it's not something we can capture easily, wrap up into a little package. So maybe, as I'm still concerned about our question, we need to think about it differently. If we want to struggle with the question, how much education do you need before you die? Maybe we should think about what you have to accomplish before you die. We should be thinking about outcomes, not thinking about this process of education, but where do you need to get? Now, certainly it's the case with a lot of our interventions. What do we want to do is we want to bring a population, usually in an underprivileged area, up to a certain level of education. so that they can participate fully in society, so they can have the health, wealth, civic benefits that are available only at that level. Now, when we talk about education that way, we're considering education instrumentally. We're considering it only in terms of what it can get you. The idea is you want to make your present self ignorant. You want to get somewhere else. You want to be away from the present. It's consequentialist thinking in education, and certainly it is valuable. But it doesn't exhaust all that there is to education. And something about our question puts pressure on that idea. What else is there? Well, I have another student who I think exemplifies a different attitude to education. This student's not in a progressive kindergarten or an elite university. This student is in San Quentin State Prison. You might think you shouldn't be teaching in the prison, it's not safe, but actually it's quite safe because the students want to have the program continue, and if it weren't safe, the program would not continue. Not only is it safe, but the students are very respectful and very polite, except for this one student. This student, a big bear of a man, a lot of hair happening in different ways, and a booming voice, and he would interrupt me. I'd be trying to lead a discussion somewhere, and he'd say, "Now hold on there, Professor. Suppose you had human continentality," and I'd be like, "That's not where we're going with the discussion." And he'd say, "Why are you always cutting me off? Why are you always defending these philosophers? I think Aristotle, he's a punk." And I'm like, "That is not appropriate for this class." He says, "Well, what's this philosophy getting us anyway?" So the discussion's not going the way I'd like for it to go in this class. Well, I find out a little bit why this is happening. My student was the kingpin in an enormous crime syndicate. My student is not used to listening to other people. People listen to him. He's the loudest one in the room. He's the big boss. He says what happens. He has certainty all the time. Oh, well, when he says this, I understand a little better. We have something in common. I say, "Oh, we are both entrepreneurs." I have a different kind of enterprise. But I understand the need for a certain attitude towards leadership in a competitive environment. I tell him, but that's not what we're doing here. Here we're doing philosophy. Here, the highest value is humility. Here, the point is to follow the ideas wherever they go. The ideas are the big boss. Here, the challenge is to let down your guard and to just experience inquiry. Well, my student, he understands this. He stays in my class. My student, who will never get out of prison, stays in my philosophy class. There's nothing he can do with that education. He can't use it. He can't sell it somewhere. It won't get him anything. He's interested in education for its own sake, inquiry for its own sake, which those of you who have read Plato remember is a distinction that Plato gave us. The distinction between something that's good for what it gets you and something that's good for its own sake. Education is both. The fact of inquiry is something that we're capable of human beings. It's kind of remarkable. Basic curiosity. So education as an exercise of that capacity, an exercise of the capacity for wonder and pursuit of an idea. When we start to think of education this way, maybe we can revisit the question I started with. And now it becomes something more of an exclamation. We say, "Oh, why? How much education we need before we die?" You can ask yourself, have you finished your education? Have you stopped learning? Which is to say, have you stopped inquiring? Which is to say, have you stopped living? Well, today you have not stopped. Thank you for doing a little philosophy with me. Thank you.